The sea remembers everything. It holds the voices of men who tended lights on distant rocks. It carries the weight of storms that swept across centuries. It keeps the silence that follows when footsteps fade and doors close for the last time. James Duckett knew this sea. He had watched it for 17 years from various lighthouse posts scattered along Scotland's unforgiving coast. The Atlantic was his companion, his adversary, his constant reminder that some forces cannot be tamed, only respected. Tonight, December 11th, 1900, he sat in the kitchen of Flannan Isle Lighthouse. The lamp above the table cast steady light across his weathered hands as he wrote in the daily log. His pen moved with the careful precision of a man who understood that records mattered, that someone, someday, might need to know what happened here. The wind outside pressed against the stone walls, not violently, not yet, just a steady reminder that winter had arrived in the Outer Hebrides, bringing with it the particular darkness that settles over northern islands when the year begins its slow turn toward the solstice. Thomas Marshall sat across from him, mending a rope with the focused attention he brought to every task. His fingers worked methodically, weaving new fibers into old, strengthening what time and salt water had worn thin. In the corner near the stove, Donald MacArthur cleaned the brass fittings from the light chamber. He was the newest of the three, having joined them only weeks ago when the regular third keeper had taken ill. But MacArthur was experienced. He knew lighthouse work. He knew the particular rhythm of days that repeated endlessly, finding meaning in that repetition. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. Its sound was so constant that the men no longer heard it consciously, yet its absence would have been immediately noticed. Time moved differently on lighthouse stations. Days blurred together, distinguished only by the weather, the state of the sea, and the small variations in routine that marked one 24-hour period from another. Duckett finished his log entry and set down his pen. The words were simple, factual. Wind from the northwest, sea moderate, light burning properly, temperature holding steady. Nothing unusual to report. He had written similar entries thousands of times, each one a small thread in the larger tapestry of maritime safety, a record that ships passing in the night had a reliable beacon to guide them away from the rocks that lurked beneath the waves. The Flannan Isles were not hospitable to human habitation. 7 small islands rising from the Atlantic, their cliffs steep and their landings treacherous. Even in calm weather, bringing supplies ashore required careful timing and steady nerves. In storms, the islands became completely inaccessible, cut off from the world for days or even weeks at a time. The lighthouse itself had been built only a year earlier, completed in December of 1899. Before its light began to shine, these waters had claimed many ships. The rocks were unmarked, the currents unpredictable, the fog frequent and dense. Sailors feared the Flannan Isles, giving them wide berth when possible, praying for clear visibility when passage nearby was unavoidable. Now the light burned every night from sunset to sunrise. 70 feet above the water, its beam swept across the sea in steady intervals, a promise of safety, a warning of danger, a simple declaration that humans had placed something permanent on this impermanent edge of land and ocean. Marshall finished his rope work and stood, stretching his back. He was a tall man, lean from years of physical labor and simple food. His face bore the lines of someone who had spent decades in weather, squinting against wind and sun, reading the moods of the sky with the practiced eye of a mariner. "I will check the stores," he said quietly. His voice was soft, as voices often became in isolated places. There was no need for volume when only two other people could hear you, and those two people were always within a few yards. Ducat nodded. MacArthur continued his cleaning, the cloth moving in small circles against the brass, removing salt and tarnish, restoring shine. It was work that never truly ended. The sea air corroded everything metal with patient determination. The keeper's job was to maintain constant vigilance against that corrosion, to keep the machinery of light functioning without interruption. Marshall descended the stone steps to the lower level where supplies were kept. The lighthouse had been designed with care, each space serving a specific purpose. The living quarters occupied the middle level, comfortable enough for 3 men to share without crowding. The light chamber sat at the top, its lens system a marvel of engineering, capable of magnifying a simple oil flame into a beam visible for miles. Below the living quarters were the stores, the fuel room, and the equipment lockers. Everything needed for weeks of self-sufficiency: kerosene for the light, coal for the stove, tinned food and dried goods, fresh water in carefully sealed containers, tools for repairs, spare parts for the light mechanism, rope, paint, oil, wicks, glass cleaners, all the mundane materials that kept the light burning and the station operational. Marshall moved through the stores with the efficiency of long habit. His hands found items in the dim light without conscious thought. He counted tins, checked water levels, noted what would need to be replenished when the relief tender arrived in a few days. The tender came every 2 weeks when weather permitted, bringing fresh supplies, mail from home, news from the mainland. It also brought the rotation that allowed each keeper to have shore leave, spending time with family before returning to the island for another stint of duty. Ducat had a wife and 4 children in the town of Oban. Marshall had a wife and young son. MacArthur had never married, but he had family, siblings and nieces and nephews who welcomed him when he came ashore. They all carried these connections with them to the island. Letters were treasured, read multiple times, kept carefully until the next mail delivery brought new words from home. The keepers spoke of their families during meals, sharing stories, keeping those relationships alive even across distance and separation. But here, in this moment, on this particular night in December, the mainland felt very far away. The lighthouse existed in its own reality, a small point of light and warmth in the vast darkness of winter sea and sky. Upstairs, Ducat prepared tea. The simple ritual of boiling water, measuring leaves, waiting for the steep. These actions had been performed so many times that they required no thought, yet they remained comforting in their familiarity. A cup of hot tea was civilization. It was routine. It was normal in a place where normal was something you had to actively maintain. MacArthur finished his cleaning and joined Ducat at the table. They sat in comfortable silence. Words were not always necessary between men who lived in close quarters. Sometimes silence spoke more clearly than speech, conveying contentment, fatigue, the simple piece of work completed. Marshall returned from his inspection below. "All stores adequate," he reported. "We are well supplied." "Good," Ducat replied. "The weather may turn. Better to have plenty if we cannot be resupplied on schedule." This was wisdom earned through experience. The Northern Lighthouse Board maintained strict protocols for provisioning, but weather made its own schedule. If storms prevented the tender from landing, the keepers needed to be self-sufficient for extended periods. They had learned to live with uncertainty, to prepare for possibilities while accepting that some things lay beyond control. The sea decided when it would allow access to the island. The wind decided when it would permit work outside the lighthouse walls. The weather decided the rhythm of their days, and they adapted to whatever rhythm was imposed. The tea was poured. They sat together, 3 men in a stone room on a rock in the Atlantic, performing the small ceremony of shared refreshment. Steam rose from the cups, carrying the faint scent of bergamot. The warmth of the ceramic against cold hands was a small pleasure, appreciated fully. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly. They could hear it now, a low sound that moved around the lighthouse, testing the walls, finding the small gaps where stone met mortar, creating the particular music that comes when air moves through confined spaces. The sea sound was constant but changing. Sometimes it was a whisper, waves gently meeting the base of the cliffs far below. Sometimes it was a roar, storm swells crashing with force that shook the ground. Tonight it was somewhere between those extremes, a steady rhythm of moderate waves meeting resistant rock. Ducat thought of the ships that might be passing in the darkness beyond their light's reach. Cargo vessels making their way between Glasgow and the open Atlantic. Fishing boats heading to or returning from the grounds. passenger steamers carrying people to distant destinations. They would never know how many ships had been saved by this light, how many captains had corrected their course upon seeing the beacon, avoiding the rocks that would have torn their hulls open. How many sailors had made it home to their families because 3 men on a remote island had kept a flame burning through the night. This was the keeper's paradox. Success was invisible. The light worked precisely because nothing happened. Ships passed safely, lives continued, and no one knew that disaster had been narrowly avoided. Only failure was noticed. If the light went dark, if ships foundered, if lives were lost, then people would ask questions, assign blame, demand accountability. But Dukat did not think in terms of glory or recognition. He thought in terms of duty. The light must burn. That was the beginning and end of his purpose here. Everything else was secondary to that simple requirement. Marshall rose and checked the clock against his pocket watch. Time to tend the light, he observed. The light required attention every 4 hours. The kerosene reservoir needed refilling. The wick needed trimming. The lens needed cleaning. The clockwork mechanism that rotated the light needed winding. It was constant work, a cycle that never stopped. Day and night, winter and summer, clear weather and foul. They took turns with this duty, rotating through 8-hour shifts so each man had time to sleep, to eat, to rest. But even when off duty, a keeper was never truly off. If something went wrong, all 3 would respond. The light was their shared responsibility, more important than individual rest or comfort. Marshall climbed the spiral stairs to the light chamber. The steps were worn smooth from thousands of ascents and descents. His hand found the rail automatically, following the curve of the wall as he rose through the tower. The light chamber was a world apart. Glass on all sides allowed an unobstructed view of sea and sky. During the day, the view was spectacular, miles of ocean visible in every direction. At night, with the light burning, it was possible to see nothing but the darkness beyond the glass and the steady rotation of the beam as it swept around and around, marking time, marking safety, marking presence. Marshall performed his checks with practiced efficiency, reservoir level adequate, wick condition good, lens clean, mechanism running smoothly, everything as it should be. He made small adjustments, the tiny corrections that kept everything operating at peak efficiency. Below, in the kitchen, Dukat was writing letters. One to his wife, sharing the small details of Lighthouse life. One to the Northern Lighthouse Board, requesting replacement parts that would be needed in coming months. His handwriting was clear and steady, the letters formed with care. MacArthur had taken out a book. He was not a great reader, but he had brought a few volumes with him, mostly history and exploration. He read slowly, absorbing the words, occasionally pausing to stare at the wall and think about what he had just read. This was how evenings passed on the lighthouse. Quietly, each man occupied with his own activity, but present together, a small society of three sustained by routine and purpose. The clock ticked, the wind blew, the sea moved against the rocks, the light turned in its chamber above, sending its message into the darkness. Time passed, hours folded into each other, distinguished only by the rotation of duty, the preparation and consumption of meals, the movement from waking to sleeping and back to waking. Days had been like this for over a year now, since the light first began to shine. They would be like this for years to come, until the lighthouse was eventually automated or decommissioned, until technology made human keepers unnecessary. But that time had not yet arrived. For now, the light required human attention, human dedication, human presence on this remote rock. And so the keepers remained. Ducat with his 17 years of service, Marshall with his careful hands and quiet competence, MacArthur with his strength and his surprising gentleness. Three men doing work that needed to be done, keeping a promise made to sailors they would never meet, maintaining a light that burned not for glory, but for necessity. The night deepened, the temperature dropped, frost began to form on the exposed stones outside, tiny crystals of ice catching what little light escaped through the windows. Inside, the stove radiated warmth. The men prepared for bed, banking the fire so it would last through the night, checking that all was secure before retiring to their small individual rooms. Each room was simple: a bed, a small table, a chair, hooks for clothing. Nothing more was needed. Nothing more would fit. Ducat lay in his bed, feeling the slight vibration that came from wind pressing against the tower. It was a feeling he had grown so accustomed to that its absence would have been disturbing. The lighthouse was never completely still. It swayed imperceptibly in strong winds, settled and creaked as temperatures changed, transmitted through its stones the constant percussion of waves against cliffs. These sounds and movements were comforting. They meant the lighthouse was doing what it was built to do, standing firm, enduring, persisting. He thought of his family, his wife Mary, his children. The oldest would be 13 now, nearly grown. The youngest only 5, hardly more than a baby when he had last seen her 3 weeks ago. He carried their images with him always. When he looked at the sea, he thought of how his youngest daughter laughed. When he tended the light, he thought of his wife's steady presence, her own form of keeping the home fires burning, while he kept this larger fire burning for strangers. The separation was difficult, but the pay was good. The work was meaningful. And every 2 weeks he went home for a few days, reconnecting, being present, before returning to this place of isolation and purpose. Marshall lay in his bed, thinking similar thoughts. His son was learning to read. His wife had written that the boy asked about the lighthouse, wanted to know what his father did all day on the island, wanted to understand why he had to go away and come back, go away and come back. How do you explain duty to a child? How do you explain that some work requires sacrifice, that keeping others safe sometimes means accepting loneliness, that light in the darkness is worth the cost of tending it? Marshall did not have those answers in words. He simply did the work, hoping that somehow his son would understand when he was older, would know that his father had been doing something important, something necessary, something that mattered beyond the boundaries of their small family. MacArthur lay in his bed, listening to the wind. He had no family waiting for him, not in the same way. But he had people who cared about him. He had a place in the world beyond this rock. Still, there were times when he wondered if he belonged more to the lighthouse than to any home on land. The sea had become familiar. The isolation had become normal. The rhythm of Keeper's life had become his rhythm, more natural than the chaotic pace of towns and cities. He was not unhappy. He was not lonely, not in any painful way. He had the companionship of Ducat and Marshall, men who understood the work, who did not need to fill silence with empty words. He had the companionship of the sea, which was always present, always speaking in its language of waves and wind, always offering the strange comfort that comes from being near something vast and ancient and indifferent to human concerns. Sleep came slowly to all 3 men that night, not because anything was wrong, simply because sleep often came slowly on lighthouses where the distinction between day and night was marked by duty rather than by darkness. But eventually, sleep did come. Their breathing slowed and deepened. Their bodies relaxed. Their minds released the small worries and large responsibilities. at least for a few hours, drifting into the particular rest that comes from physical exhaustion and purpose fulfilled. The light continued to turn, the beam continued to sweep, the message continued to pulse into the darkness. Here is safety. Here is warning. Here is the boundary between deep water and breaking rocks. Navigate accordingly, and ships did navigate accordingly. Somewhere out in the darkness, captains made small corrections to their courses. Somewhere sailors looked up and saw the light and felt reassured. Somewhere the work of 3 men on a remote island made the difference between disaster and safe passage. They would never know this. The rescued never meet their rescuers when the rescue is simply a light burning in the night. But the work mattered nonetheless. The hours passed, midnight came and went. The new day arrived, though in darkness it was impossible to tell without consulting clocks. Marshall rose for his turn at tending the light. He dressed quickly in the cold air, pulled on his heavy wool jacket, and climbed the stairs. The light chamber was colder than the rooms below, glass providing insulation from wind, but not from temperature. His breath misted in the air as he worked, performing the familiar tasks, keeping everything running smoothly. Through the glass he could see nothing but darkness and the reflection of the light itself, turning, always turning. The sea was invisible except when occasional whitecaps caught the beam, flashing briefly white before disappearing back into black. The wind had grown stronger. He could hear it more clearly now, a higher pitch as it moved past the glass, finding the gaps and edges, creating that particular whistle that meant weather was changing. A storm was building somewhere out in the Atlantic. It might reach them tomorrow. It might pass to the north or south. Weather was unpredictable this time of year, systems moving rapidly, bringing sudden changes, catching even experienced men by surprise. But the lighthouse had been built to withstand the worst weather the Atlantic could produce. The engineers had calculated wave heights and wind speeds, had designed walls thick enough and foundations deep enough to endure century storms, the rare events that might happen once in 100 years. The lighthouse had already weathered several significant storms in its brief year of operation. It had stood firm while waves broke over the landing platforms 100 feet below the light. It had remained steady while wind speeds exceeded anything measured on the mainland. It would stand through whatever came next. Of this, Marshall had no doubt. He finished his duties and made his way back down to the kitchen. He was due to wake MacArthur for the next shift, but there was no rush. He poured himself tea from the pot that stayed warm on the back of the stove, adding a splash of milk and a spoonful of sugar. The tea was too hot to drink immediately. He held the cup in both hands, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. Small pleasures meant more in places like this. A hot cup of tea in the middle of a cold night was a treasure, appreciated fully because its context made it precious. He thought about the rope he had been mending earlier. It would be ready for use tomorrow, stronger for having been repaired, serviceable for months more before it would need attention again. There was satisfaction in such work, making things last, maintaining what could be maintained, respecting the materials and tools that allowed them to do their job. The Northern Lighthouse Board provided good equipment, but equipment required care. The keepers were expected to maintain everything to the highest standards, to treat each item as if it might be the single thing that stood between safety and disaster. And perhaps it was. Perhaps the rope Marshall had mended would be the rope that secured a supply crate during the next landing. Perhaps that secure crate would contain the fuel that kept the light burning through the next week. Perhaps that burning light would be seen by a ship that needed its guidance. Everything connected. Every small task contributed to the larger purpose. Nothing was insignificant when the work involved saving lives. Marshall finished his tea and quietly woke MacArthur. The changing of the watch required few words. MacArthur nodded, dressed, and took his turn climbing the stairs. Marshall returned to his bed, pulled the wool blankets close, and found sleep again. The night continued its slow passage toward dawn. The light continued its reliable rotation. The wind continued its build in strength. And 3 men continued the work they had committed to doing, tending the light, keeping the watch, maintaining the promise. This was December 12th, 1900, the last full day that James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur would spend together on Flannan Isle. But they could not know this. They could only know the present moment, the current duty, the immediate task. Tomorrow would bring what it brought. For now there was only the light, the sea, and the quiet dedication of men doing work that mattered in ways they would never fully comprehend. The night was deep and cold and endless, as all winter nights feel when lived on the edge of the ocean. But inside the lighthouse there was warmth, there was purpose, there was the steady comfort of routine, of familiar tasks of shared commitment to something larger than individual concerns. The light burned, the watch continued. Time moved forward, carrying these men and this moment toward whatever future waited beyond the horizon. Outside, the sea moved in its eternal rhythms, patient and powerful, indifferent to human presence, yet intimately connected to human survival. The waves would continue long after the lighthouse was forgotten. The wind would blow long after the last keeper's name faded from memory. But for now, in this moment, 3 men kept a light burning in the darkness. And that light was enough. Rest now.